My name is Adrian Holt, 32 years old. The conference room at Harrison Industries felt smaller than usual, like the walls had leaned in overnight and decided to listen. Dad had called an emergency board meeting on a Friday afternoon, which meant one thing. He wanted maximum drama with minimum resistance. That was his style. Drop the grenade right before the weekend and let everyone bleed out in silence for 2 days before they were allowed to speak again. Mom sat beside him at the head of the table, her designer suit perfectly pressed, her posture as sharp as the line of her jaw. She wore the same expression she used when firing housekeepers for not being a good fit. My older brother Marcus occupied the seat that should have been mine, the one marked Executive Vice President. I sat 3 chairs down next to the intern, close enough to hear everything, far enough to pretend I didn't matter. The conference table was Italian marble, the kind that costs more than most people's cars. The ergonomic chairs had been imported from Denmark, because apparently domestic lumbar support just wasn't good enough for Harrison Industries. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed downtown from the 42nd floor, the glass reflecting back a version of us that looked like a real family company instead of what we actually were, a hierarchy with blood ties and bruised loyalties. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Dad began, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he'd already made the decision and was just performing the theater of consultation. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked past me, above me, through me. "Harrison Industries has reached a critical juncture," he continued. "We've been profitable, yes, but we're not optimized. We're not lean. We're not positioned for the aggressive expansion this market demands." I took a sip of water and said nothing. I'd heard some version of this speech before, but something in his cadence felt different today. Less like a strategy meeting, more like a eulogy. Mom folded her hands on the table, her nails a perfect neutral pink that always made me think of polished stone. "We've brought in outside expertise," she added smoothly, "to help us move to the next level." On the other side of the table sat 3 strangers in suits that did not come off the rack. The lead one had carefully styled silver hair and a watch that cost more than the car I drove. He stood up as the first slide appeared on the screen behind him. "Harrison Industries, restructuring for maximum efficiency." His presentation clicker made a soft, precise sound, like a tiny hammer hitting a tiny nail into my future. "What we've discovered," Silverhair began, "is an organization burdened by redundant management layers, unclear reporting structures, and several positions that exist more out of historical precedent than operational necessity." Redundant, historical, unnecessary. He said the words clinically, the way a surgeon might talk about removing an organ they'd never personally needed. Mom leaned forward, eyes bright. "Tell them about the cost savings." "Our projections indicate," he said, "that by streamlining management and eliminating redundant positions, Harrison Industries could reduce operational costs by 37% while actually improving decision-making speed and market responsiveness." Marcus grinned. He'd been waiting for this moment since he joined the company 5 years ago. I'd been here for 7. I'd never made a fuss about titles or corner offices. I just did my work, managed my projects, and apparently became invisible in the process. The slide changed. The org chart appeared like an autopsy photo. At the top, Dad, CEO and President. Directly beneath, Marcus, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. Below him, a neat row of department heads, lines descending like a pyramid. My name appeared in a small box near the bottom. Special Projects Coordinator. A demotion of 3 levels. I felt the intern next to me glance at the screen, then at me, then quickly back down at his notepad like he was afraid proximity to my name might be contagious. "The key," Silverhair continued, "is to consolidate authority in a clear chain of command. One vision, one direction, no confusion about who makes final decisions." The words landed heavier than they should have. One vision, one direction, no confusion. It sounded less like strategy and more like someone sweeping the board clean so only their pieces remained. "Now, I know some of you might be concerned about these changes," Dad said, his tone making it very clear he didn't actually care about anyone's concerns, "but this is about the future of this company. My father built Harrison Industries from nothing. I've grown it into what it is today, and Marcus will take it to heights we can only imagine. This requires sacrifice. This requires making tough decisions. Starting with unnecessary staff," Mom added, finally looking directly at me. It was the first time her eyes had touched my face since the meeting began. The room went quiet. No shuffling papers, no clearing throats, just the hum of the air conditioning and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Everyone knew what unnecessary staff meant. "We'll be offering generous severance packages, of course," Silverhair said smoothly. 3 months' salary, continuation of benefits, and outplacement services. The intern beside me shifted uncomfortably, as if his chair had suddenly become too small. I placed my water glass down carefully. The sound of glass on marble rang louder than it should have. "Any questions?" Dad asked, in a tone that suggested questions would be treated as insubordination. James from accounting raised his hand, hesitated, then forced it higher. "What's the timeline for these changes?" "Effective immediately," Marcus said, speaking for the first time. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. "We're announcing the new structure Monday. Transition will be complete within 2 weeks." "This is about efficiency," Dad repeated, "about removing obstacles to growth. Some people understand business, understand what it takes to compete at this level. Others—" He paused and looked at me. "Others are better suited to different environments, less demanding environments." Mom actually smiled. "Perhaps something in education or nonprofit work, something that matches your capabilities." There it was, the knife without the courtesy of a disguise. I pulled out my phone and typed a single text message with hands that did not shake. They wanted maximum drama. Fine. They were about to get it. I looked up at Dad, then at Mom, then at Marcus with his smug, carefully controlled expression, at Silverhair and his team of consultants who'd just recommended carving up a quarter of the staff to pad their own fees. "Are these changes already filed with the parent company?" I asked quietly. Dad frowned. "What?" "The restructuring plan," I said. "The new organizational chart. The terminations. Have they been submitted to the holding company for approval?" Silverhair blinked. "There's a holding company?" "Of course there's no holding company," Dad snapped, irritation leaking through his professional mask. "Harrison Industries is privately held. I own it. This is my decision to make." For a moment, no one breathed. I could feel the weight of what he didn't know hanging in the air between us like a storm cloud. "Actually," I thought. His phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned before answering. "Yes." I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched his expression change in real time. Irritation, confusion, and then something I hadn't seen on his face in years, uncertainty. "What do you mean rejected?" he said into the phone. "I haven't even submitted anything yet." His grip on the phone tightened. A vein in his temple began to pulse. "How would they even know about—" He stopped, listening. His eyes flicked to me for a fraction of a second, like a man suddenly aware that the floor might not be as solid as he'd believed. Yes, I understand. I'll call you back." He ended the call and just stared at me, really looked at me, not like unnecessary staff, not like a problem to solve, like a variable he'd never accounted for. "That was our corporate attorney," he said slowly. "He just received a call from the holding company's legal team. Apparently someone forwarded them the restructuring proposal, and it's been rejected. All of it." "That's impossible," Mom said sharply. "The holding company is just paperwork. It's not a real thing." My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, then stood up. "If you'll excuse me, I need to take this." I walked over to the windows, the city spread out below like a circuit board. Every building, a component in a system most people never bothered to understand. "Hello, Richard," I said into the phone. "Ms. Holt," the voice on the other end replied, calm and precise. "I've sent the formal rejection notice to your father's attorney. The restructuring proposal violates multiple clauses in the subsidiary operating agreement. Shall I schedule a meeting to review compliance requirements?" "Please do," I said. "Let's say Monday morning, 9 a.m., conference room A." "Conference room A is reserved for board meetings only." "I know." I ended the call and turned back toward the room. Every pair of eyes was on me now. Dad's, Mom's, Marcus's, the consultants, the interns. For the first time in 7 years at Harrison Industries, no one was pretending I wasn't there. And for the first time, I wasn't planning to let them forget it. The silence in the conference room felt heavier than the marble table, like the whole building was holding its breath. Dad's face was still pale from the phone call. Mom was frozen in a half-formed protest, and Marcus looked like someone had kicked the legs out from under his throne. I walked back toward my seat but didn't sit. Not yet. There was a particular kind of power in standing when everyone else was rooted in confusion. Dad finally found his voice. "What exactly did you do?" I met his eyes calmly. "I followed company procedure, something you apparently forgot existed." Silverhair cleared his throat. "Excuse me, but There's a holding company. We reviewed all the documents we were given, and you weren't given all the documents, I said, because you weren't authorized to review all of them. Mom snapped out of her shock. Adrian, stop being dramatic. We all know Harrison Industries isn't beholden to some imaginary umbrella entity created for tax purposes. It's not imaginary, I said. It's very real. Harrison Holdings LLC owns Harrison Industries outright, 100%. Marcus scoffed. Dad owns Harrison Industries. Everyone knows that. I finally sat down, folding my hands on the table. Dad owns the operating company, the one with employees, buildings, client contracts. Harrison Holdings owns that, and someone owns Harrison Holdings. Who? Dad demanded. I let the question hang for a moment. It wasn't petty. It was necessary. I needed them to feel the weight of not knowing. Grandfather named me the sole member and controlling board director of the holding company, I said quietly. I've held that position since the day he died. It was as if the air evaporated from the room. No, Mom whispered. No, he left everything to your father. He left the shares of Harrison Industries to Dad, I corrected. He left the shares of Harrison Holdings LLC to me. All of them. Marcus shook his head like he could dislodge the truth. That's ridiculous. Why would he do that? Maybe, I said, because he wanted someone watching the big picture, someone who wasn't blinded by ambition. Silverhair stared down at his notes as though they had betrayed him. So when you say you own Harrison Holdings, you mean... I said, I own everything Harrison Industries thinks it owns. Every share, every asset, every property, every contract, every executive decision ultimately requires my approval. The consultants exchanged panicked glances. Their carefully rehearsed posture was gone, replaced by sharp breaths and fidgeting hands. Silverhair stood abruptly. We have a signed agreement. That lacks legal authority, I interrupted. Harrison Industries cannot approve consulting contracts over $50,000 without a competitive bidding process and holding company sign-off. Yours was for $300,000. That clause is standard boilerplate, he argued faintly. And binding, I replied. Your contract is void. You'll receive a kill fee for work performed, but your recommendations are rejected, effective immediately. He froze for 3 seconds, then gave a curt nod and began packing his materials. The other consultants followed, all stiff motions and tight jaws. Their footsteps echoed across the marble floor as they left the room without a single protest. Dad shot to his feet. You can't just fire outside consultants without my approval. You hired them without mine, I said, and you didn't have the authority to do that. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. This is insane. You're tying our hands. You're putting the entire company under a microscope just because you're mad about a demotion? I held his gaze evenly. No, I'm enforcing a corporate structure that's been in place for 7 years. A structure grandfather created. A structure you all forgot because you never bothered to read what you signed. Mom exhaled sharply, the sound brittle. We've been running this company just fine. We don't need you reviewing our decisions like some kind of boss. I felt a flicker of something. Hurt, maybe. But I didn't let it surface. I don't want to micromanage. I don't want Dad's job. I don't want Marcus's job. But I do want decisions made legally and ethically. Dad tried again. Fine, what happens now? Effective immediately, I said, all executive decisions above the department head level will be reviewed by the holding company's legal team before implementation. That's bureaucracy, Marcus snapped. You're slowing everything down. Only the bad decisions, I said. Good decisions backed by data will be approved quickly. The intern blinked at me like I had grown a second head. He had never heard me speak more than 3 words in a row. Now I was rewriting the company's entire chain of command. Dad paced behind his chair, running both hands through his thinning hair. What about the restructuring proposal? Rejected, I said. Permanently. The holding company agreement specifically forbids any changes that undermine environmental stability at the executive level without board approval. Mom frowned. Environmental stability? It means you can't destabilize leadership roles just because you want to shuffle power, I said. Marcus glared at me. You're doing this because you're hurt, because you think we don't appreciate you. For a moment, something inside me twisted, because that wasn't entirely wrong, but it also wasn't the whole truth. I'm doing this, I said calmly, because you tried to fire me, and because you did it illegally. The words hung in the air like frost. My father built this company, Dad said quietly, and Grandfather built the structure that protects it from people who take too much power without understanding the consequences, I replied. Dad's phone vibrated again. He looked at it, didn't answer, then dropped heavily into his chair. That's probably Richard, I said. He's thorough. He'll want to schedule a detailed review of all major decisions made in the last 3 years. Dad's head jerked up. What does that mean? It means some decisions may need to be ratified, others corrected. For example, I turned to Marcus. Your compensation package. Marcus froze. You can't be serious. You received a 40% raise plus equity grants, plus a company car, I said, all without holding company approval. Technically, your compensation is unauthorized. Dad's voice cracked. Don't do this. I'm not undoing anything, I said. Yet. But everything has to go through the proper channels now, because that's how governance works. For the first time, Marcus looked afraid. Not angry, not superior, afraid. I stood gathering my bag. The holding company board meeting is set for Monday, 9 a.m., conference room A. All executive leadership is required to attend. No one moved. No one breathed. And one more thing, I added. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm not seeking revenge, but I won't be invisible anymore. I walked toward the door, the room still frozen in disbelief. Adrian, Dad called after me, voice small for the first time I could remember. Why now? Why reveal this now? I paused at the doorway. Because today, I said, you made it clear you were willing to erase me. Then I left. The door closed behind me with the softest click I'd ever heard. But it sounded like a gavel. Monday morning arrived cold and razor sharp, the kind of morning that made the city feel like glass, beautiful, fragile, and dangerous if handled carelessly. I reached the office at 7:30, 2 hours before the meeting, because I needed space. Not for strategy, for stillness. For the last quiet moment before everything shifted permanently. Conference room A was already unlocked. The motion lights flicked on as I entered, illuminating the long mahogany table that had hosted decisions, alliances, betrayals, and celebrations I had never been invited to witness. For years, I'd passed this room on my way to smaller meetings in windowless spaces, imagining what it must feel like to sit at the head of that table. Now that seat belonged to me. Richard, meticulous, unflappable Richard, was arranging binders, placing pens parallel to notepads, and adjusting the projector like a man preparing for a courtroom battle. Morning, he said without looking up. Everything's ready. Everyone confirmed they'll be here at 9. Good. I sat at the head of the table for the first time. The leather was cold, but it warmed quickly under my hands, like the room was acknowledging a new owner. Richard flipped open a folder. Just so you know, some of the reactions may be emotional. That's fine, I said. This meeting isn't about emotions. He gave me a look. With respect, Adrian, every meeting in this company is about emotions. They've just been disguised as business decisions. I couldn't argue with that. I'd lived in the shadow of those disguised emotions for 7 years. By 8:55, the atmosphere outside the boardroom shifted. The hurried steps, hushed voices, nervous murmurs. The door opened exactly at 9. Dad entered first. He looked like he hadn't slept. His tie was crooked, his eyes rimmed with red, and his expression was a mix of resignation and buried indignation. Mom followed with a stiff, unreadable face, the kind of mask she wore at funerals and charity galas she didn't want to attend. Marcus arrived last, right on the clock, jaw clenched, trying to keep his pride stitched together. The department heads slipped in behind them. Sarah from operations, James from accounting, David the CFO, and Linda from HR. All of them looked unsure where to sit. I gestured to the chairs. Please, everyone take a seat. They hesitated, because for the first time, they weren't sure of the hierarchy. Eventually, they sat. This is the quarterly board meeting of Harrison Holdings LLC, I said, voice steady. For those unaware, this meeting has been required for 7 years and never actually held. We'll correct that today. A wave of discomfort rippled around the table. Richard stood. Let's begin with the subsidiary operating agreement. He passed out thick packets of paper, the weight of them landing like small judgments. Please turn to page 12, section 4.3. Papers rustled, tension tightened. As stated, Richard continued, all major operational decisions by Harrison Industries require approval from Harrison Holdings. This includes structural reorganizations, executive compensation exceeding specific thresholds, capital expenditures above $100,000, and any terminations of executive-level personnel. David, the CFO, raised his hand slowly. Does this mean every major decision we've made has been unauthorized? Not every, I said. Routine business operations are fine. Anything extraordinary should have gone through the holding company. And they didn't, Marcus muttered. Because, I replied, no one bothered to check the corporate structure. Mom finally broke her silence. We trusted your father. Her voice was thin, stretched. We assumed the structure was symbolic. Grandfather didn't create symbolic structures, I said. He built safeguards. Richard continued, we'll begin with recent decisions that require review. Marcus stiffened when the first slide appeared. Executive compensation package, Marcus Harrison. I watched the blood drain from his face. 3 years ago, Richard said, your compensation increased by 40%, plus equity grants valued at approximately $2 million and additional perks. Marcus tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Dad approved that. Yes, I said, as CEO of Harrison Industries, but decisions of that size require holding company approval. That never happened. Dad's jaw tightened. You're not taking that away from him. I'm not, I said, and Marcus blinked in surprise. I've reviewed his performance from that period. The package was justified. I'm retroactively approving it effective today. Marcus swallowed. Confusion flickered through anger. He didn't know what to do with mercy. Next slide, restructuring plan, review. The red numbers on Silverhair's proposal looked ghastly next to the detailed analysis Richard and I had prepared. My projection models were clean, precise, with glowing red flags around productivity loss, turnover risk, and damage to institutional knowledge. This restructuring, I said calmly, would have destroyed the company. Mom scoffed. 37% cost reduction is hardly destruction. At the expense of service quality, I said. At the expense of morale. At the expense of your longest-serving people. I looked at Sarah, who had been with the company 20 years. This plan was never about efficiency. It was about consolidating power. Dad flinched, a small movement but noticeable. There was a time I would have softened then. A time I would have let him keep his dignity uninterrupted. Not today. I prevented a similar restructuring in 2022, I said. You came within one signature of eliminating 30 positions. I asked James to delay paperwork until you got busy with the acquisitions project. James's head jerked up. You told me to stall? I suggested we double-check the long-term projections, I said, which we should always do. Dad looked stunned. You interfered. I protected the company, quietly, because that's what Grandfather asked me to do. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. So what, you've been spying? No, I said. I've been learning, observing, and stepping in only when necessary. The room simmered with a mix of shame, anger, and dawning understanding. Richard displayed the next slide. Governance protocols, implementation. Going forward, I said, any major decision will undergo a 48-hour review by the holding company, not to delay you, but to protect you. David exhaled, the tension easing from his shoulders. Honestly, that might help. We've needed more strategic guidance for years. Mom bristled. This will slow everything down. It will slow bad decisions, I replied. It will support good ones. Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't shock. It was acceptance shadowed by bruised pride. Dad finally looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Uncertainty mixed with something darker. Tell me, Adrian, he said quietly. After everything, what do you want? It was a strange moment. Strange because for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't speaking as CEO. He was speaking as a father. I didn't answer yet. That answer belonged to the next part of the story, the part where I finally claimed my place. Let's finish the review, I said instead. Then I'll tell you. The meeting continued, but the center of gravity in the room had already shifted. For 7 years, I had been invisible. For 7 years, they'd believed the quiet one had no teeth. For 7 years, they thought authority belonged to the loudest voices in the room. Not anymore. And they all knew it. The meeting stretched into its second hour, but the tension had settled into something quieter, something heavier, like the room itself was finally willing to acknowledge truths that had been ignored for far too long. When Richard closed the last binder, the weight of unfinished business hung over us like an unfinished sentence. Dad shifted uncomfortably, cleared his throat, and finally asked the question he'd been circling around all morning. So, what happens now? It wasn't the booming voice of the CEO. It wasn't the confident timbre of a man used to being obeyed. It was hesitant, stripped bare, almost vulnerable. I'd never seen him look so unsure, not even when Grandfather died. I looked around the table before answering. Every face was tense, every gaze fixed on me. This moment, was why I stayed quiet for 7 years, so that when I finally spoke, it mattered. Now, I said, we put everything back in its rightful place. Mom bristled. Are you taking over? Is that what this is about? You want control now, after all these years? No, I said simply. I don't want your job, or Dad's job. I never did. Marcus scoffed softly, like he didn't believe me. I turned to him. If I wanted to run the company, Marcus, I could have replaced you before you ever sat in that executive chair. I didn't. That should tell you something. For a flicker of a moment, something, confusion, respect, passed across his face, then disappeared. I continued. Everyone keeps thinking this is about revenge, or recognition, or ego. It's not. It's about governance, it's about responsibility, and it's about not pretending anymore. Dad exhaled slowly. So what changes exactly? Two things, I said, holding up two fingers. First, formal compliance. All major decisions must go through proper channels. No improvisation, no shortcuts, no restructuring plans drafted in secret, no consultants hired without authorization. We follow the rules laid out in the subsidiary operating agreement. Every single one. That landed like a stone in a still pond. Small sound, enormous ripples. And second, Mom asked, folding her arms defensively. Second, I said, I want a seat at this table, a real one. A beat of silence. Marcus's brows furrowed. What seat? Chief Strategy Officer, I said. Responsible for long-term planning, risk mitigation, governance oversight, and corporate structure. Reporting directly to the CEO, with the authority to bring major issues to the holding company board when necessary. Richard slid a freshly printed organizational chart down the table. My name appeared just below Dad and parallel to Marcus, no longer in a tiny box at the bottom. Linda from HR let out a small, involuntary "oh." David, the CFO, nodded slowly, his expression softening. Honestly, that makes sense. We've needed someone thinking at the structural level for a long time. Dad stared at the paper for several seconds. His fingers trembled just slightly. When he finally looked up at me, the anger was gone. Only sadness and understanding remained. Your grandfather would be proud, he said quietly. I held his gaze. Would he? I'm not sure. Mom frowned. Why would you say that? Because, I said, he asked me to observe, to learn, to understand the business from the inside before I ever interfered, and I did, for 7 years. But maybe I should have stepped in sooner. Maybe I should have stopped more of the bad decisions. Maybe I let too much happen because I wanted to believe the company could run itself. Dad swallowed hard. I'd never seen him look so small. You did what he asked, Dad said. He told me that once, that you were smart but untested. He said you needed to understand the business from every angle before you could ever lead it. I didn't understand what he meant then. And now? I asked. Now, I do. Mom looked down at her hands. For once, the sharpness in her demeanor cracked. I'm sorry, she said suddenly, for what I said on Friday, calling you unnecessary staff. That was cruel and wrong. I didn't soften, not out of spite, but because the truth mattered. It was honest, I said. You believed it. Maybe others did too. I worked hard to be invisible. I let people underestimate me. I let people take credit for my work. I stayed quiet because I thought it was what Grandfather wanted. That ends now. Her eyes shimmered for a moment before she looked away. Dad cleared his throat. And Marcus? My brother stiffened. If Adrian's chief strategy officer, Dad continued, you'll need to work closely together. Share information. No more surprises. No more under-the-table decisions. Marcus's jaw worked, opening once, closing again. Then he exhaled through his nose. If this is what's needed for the company to function correctly, he said grudgingly, then fine. It wasn't acceptance, it wasn't peace, but it was enough. The rest of the meeting ran like it should have run for years. We reviewed financials, upcoming projects, procedural corrections. And slowly, the room relaxed. Not because they were comfortable, but because the truth had been dragged into the light, and it was finally impossible to ignore. One by one, the executives left the room. Their murmurs faded down the hallway. The door clicked shut. Dad lingered, staring down at the organizational chart one last time. I really am sorry, he said. Not just for Friday, for not seeing you, for thinking being quiet meant you didn't care, or weren't capable. You saw me, I said. Just the version of me I wanted you to see. The one who didn't cause problems, didn't demand attention, didn't challenge you. Why? He asked quietly. Because Grandfather asked me to. Because I wanted to know if the company could run without my interference. Because I wanted to know if you'd value me for my work, or just my last name. Dad nodded slowly. And now you know. I know, I said. He placed the chart back on the table. Chief Strategy Officer, he repeated softly. You'll do well. I've been doing well for 7 years, I said. Now people will just know. He nodded once, then left. I sat alone for a moment, the room warm and silent. The city stretched beyond the windows, mine now, in ways no one ever realized. Maybe grandfather planned all of this. Maybe he just trusted me to figure it out. Either way, this was the moment he'd been waiting for. I gathered my materials and walked toward my new office, the one Marcus had used as a storage closet. It smelled like dust, cardboard, and potential. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't big, but it was mine, earned, not gifted, claimed, not handed over, visible, not forgotten. And as I stepped into that small, cluttered room, I felt it, the quiet certainty that everything had changed.